Well, told you back a little bit earlier that we're going to be mainly working on two styles of engines here. Of course, the opposed, and mainly concentrating on the Lycoming opposed. But of course, we also work on a Continental that we have in a 402 out there and several of our aircraft. But you'll get a lot of hands-on with the Lycoming type engine, of course. But then the other engine we're going to be dealing with and it is the radial engine, where the cylinders are radially around the crankcase on the radial engine. Radial engines have been around for a long time. In fact, it was back in the teens when they started developing some of the early radial engines. And you look at the old museums, they had crazy where the crankshaft was stationary and the propeller was hooked to the cylinder assembly, which rotated around, and very strange engine in that manner. But things really got going in about, let me just read one little thing here. In about 1926 was when things really began to happen, when some of the top personnel at the Curtiss Aeronautical, which they had been building an engine called the Curtiss-Wright 5 Whirlwind, which is a popular engine for a lot of aircraft back then, but that top personnel left, and they purchased a machine shop called the Curtiss Aeronautical, the Curtiss Aeronautical folks left, and they purchased a machine shop called the Pratt & Whitney. So within 5 years, Pratt & Whitney, along with Curtiss, had put out 1820 and an 1830 radial engine. And then, of course, Pratt & Whitney, which we have a 985 out there, Pratt & Whitney 985 develops 450 horsepower. We've got our cutaway of our R2800 and double row, and we'll take a look at that a little closer up in just a second. But radial engines, there's a good percentage, a percentage of you will probably go to work somewhere where you're dealing with some radial engine. And so that's why and there's still a lot of information out there. And a lot of aircraft used radial engines, and a tremendous number, in fact, because you go back and take a look at all of the aircraft that had a radial engine. And this is just some of them. But for instance, the B-17, built by Boeing, they produced 12,716 of those. And it was over roughly a 3-year period. They were pumping out like 30 airplanes a week out of the factories. B-24s, 19,260. B-26s, 5,266. B-25s, 8,012. And then you can, if you know some of these aircraft, you can picture some of them being single engines, twin engines, 4 engines. AT-6s, single engine, of course, 14,231. Beach trainers, 8,600. F4Fs, 8,478. F6Fs, 12,275. And the list just goes on and on and on. And so after, especially the war, there was a lot of surplus of the radial engine stuff. And to this day, there's people, people purchase a warehouse and that old guy will die and somebody else comes along and purchases a warehouse full of this radial engine. And you can still purchase some like crop dusters, new built crop dusters that come with a freshly rebuilt radial engine on the thing. But you look back at some of the old wartime photos and stuff, and you can see in this picture, look at that guy standing in just a field of cylinders that are all getting ready, brand new cylinders that are getting ready to go onto the aircraft to go over and fight the war. But and some of those photos were just amazing. And so the radial engines, they came in, of course, like Pratt & Whitney, produced single row, double row, and then, of course, the famous 4360. It was a 4-row, 4,000 horsepower, I believe it was. Don't quote me on that. I should have looked that up to revisit that. But that 4360 was used by the military in their and the Globemasters, the old C-124s. And when I was a little kid on bicycles riding around, out at McCord Air Force Base, I used to see those C-124s with that 4360 growling away on those things. The Radial engine was kind of a majestic, powerful, and they were very popular because they could produce a lot of horsepower and not turn a very high RPM. They have kind of a special sound of their own. You know, in fact, I was just outside the other day and I heard that low beat, kind of a rumble, and I was sure so it was a double wing Radial engine powered aircraft flying over with that special sound, just kind of chug chug chug. Give you a little sound here. They always got that special sound that they make. Hope this is coming through okay on the video. And they actually had that one pumped up to a fairly high RPM. It says they usually got a little bit more of a lower rumble. So the 4360 was actually the largest engine that was actually ever utilized. I'll just show you a quick little picture here. Some guys standing beside a XR 7755 was the biggest Radial engine ever built. In 1943, Lycoming, of all people, companies, Lycoming unveiled the biggest and most powerful aircraft piston engine of all time. The 5,000 horsepower XR 7755 was a liquid-cooled, turbocharged Radial, had 4 rows of 9 cylinders, and of course had that piston displacement of 7,755. It consumed fuel at the rate of 580 gallons. It was 10 feet long, 5 feet in diameter, weighed 6,000 pounds, and had overhand cab shafts that could be shifted axially for takeoff or cruise power. Coaxial propellers and 2-speed gearbox between the crankshaft and propeller shaft. It was planned for 7,000 horsepower in its development. Unfortunately, there was never an aircraft that was built that was large enough to handle or had a need for those engines. And soon the jet age started to come about, and so the only surviving XR 7755 is in the Silver Hill facility of the Smithsonian. So they were doing quite a few things with that. And then, of course, after the war, with all of these Radial engines around, and different guys were getting creative with the things too. You take a look at this, where someone, as their theme motorcycle for this guy that owns this A26 over there, they build these theme bikes, and so there's a Radial engine put into that motorbike there. Here was another version of a custom bike, Radial engine put into that. Anyway, so Radial engines is something that, of course, we've got lots of test questions on it, and we've got several things that we do. Now, the cylinder assembly, of course, you guys are going to be learning to deal with your cylinders, with your valves, your rings, and all that stuff. And so if you know how to work on one of those, you can also work on the Radial engine cylinder. So we'll spend quite a bit of our time dealing with the lower end, that crankcase section of the engine. But a couple things to start off with here, just some common knowledge things. Sure, we're in the picture here good. So Radial engine, here's our crankcase section here, and then coming straight up here is always going to be your number 1 cylinder. And so when I'm dealing with a double row engine, I can always identify, because they'll do like the rear row is the odd numbered cylinders, and the front are the even. But you can always tell which is which, because there'll be one of those rows will have a cylinder that's pointing straight up. And of course, then that's going to be cylinders 1, 3, 5, 7, and so on. But with a Radial engine, I'll just kind of run around here and get my cylinders on here. And then the cylinders, they are as viewed from the rear of the engine. So I'd be back where I can see the accessories and those sort of things, or from that pilot seat, if you will, and looking forward, the cylinders are numbered clockwise running around that thing. So make sure we get this right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So if I'm, let me double check something here. Make sure you get you squared away on this one. Yeah, so the cylinders are numbered clockwise as viewed from the rear of the engine. Starting with your number 1 up there. Okay, a couple of things about the radial engine as well too. Some people have asked the question, why do radial engines always have an odd number of cylinders? And so they'll either have like a 5-cylinder, 7-cylinder, 9-cylinder in those respective rows, or just a single row. And I'll kind of show you an example here. So we talked about how, how do you figure out how far is it from when one cylinder fires to when the next cylinder fires. And so this having you got 720 degrees, that 2 revolutions of the crankshaft, and then you of course divide that by 9, then it's 80 degrees of crankshaft travel from when one cylinder fires to the next cylinders. So if you start off here, we got cylinder number 1, and that's another thing too. So the firing order on this that works out is, the rule is you always fire the odd first, then the even numbered cylinders. So we start off with cylinder number 1, and then you look at the spacing here. This isn't quite down 90 degrees. It's up here at that, of course, it's going to be the 80 degrees. So as the propeller is rotating across here, and I'm going, so 1, 3, and that's 80 degrees. Then it's another 80 degrees from 3 to 5, and then another 80 degrees up here to 7, another 80 degrees to 9, and then another 80 over to 2, another 80 to 4, 6, 8, and back to number 1, starting all over again. And so, so that gives us an even number of spacing from when one cylinder fires to the next. One thing that's kind of crazy, when you're looking at cylinder numbering and so on, is the propeller. If I'm doing a compression check where I start off with number 1, the propeller blade, they've got the crankshaft keyed. So radial engines, when you look at the crankshaft that's sticking out there, back down here is your counterweight assembly. Your master rod, we'll take a look at that in just a second here. The master rod assembly attaches over here off center, so that's why the counterweight providing for static balance on that guy. And then as I look around here, I'll come to a point here where this spline is larger than these other ones. That's called the master spline. That's so that prop will only go on one way. And so then start off with the blade over number 1. Then when I rotate it to cylinder number 3, then the blade out there would be lined up with number 3. So when you're going to learn to do a compression check on your Lycomings and stuff, you'll be putting your thumb over the hole and you'll be rotating the prop, and when that compression comes up in the cylinder, then you're near your top center and so on. So with the radial engine, you don't have to get your first one done, but then as you rotate it, the blade just has to be directly over each cylinder, and that automatically puts that cylinder at its top center on a compression stroke. There's an interesting test question that talks about how a cylinder, you start off with number 1, and then the prop was rotated 270 degrees, and that was found I wasn't holding compression on number 3. And of course, now you can see that makes sense. That shouldn't hold compression because I only needed to rotate that 80 degrees for number 3 to be on its compression stroke. But in the question it says it was rotated 270 degrees. So knowing a couple things there, that question, I've got my firing order, which I know is 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 2, 4, and so on. So it's only 80 degrees from when one cylinder fires to the next. So that cylinder should not hold compression if rotated 270 degrees. So that's just kind of testing your theory on that radial engine a little bit. Okay. Next thing is, so we just took a look at the firing order of a single row. Let's take a second to go out here and, of course, introduce ourselves again to the double row. So here, of course, is our R2800. That's got, of course, the traditional Hamilton standard hydromatic propeller on it. Right up front here, be a little closer in on that guy. That's a question particular to radial engines. They'll ask, what type of ball bearing is used as the thrust bearing on a radial engine? And the answer to that is a deep groove ball bearing or radial ball type bearing up as the thrust bearing on that. And so the grooves where the balls sit in are just simply cut out a little deeper to handle that side load or that thrust load that it puts onto it. Then, of course, we talked about how we have our planetary gear reduction system here. And then, of course, this is your magneto that sits here. This one would be over here, of course. And then you got looking at your front row, your back row, and you can see how this cylinder here pointing straight up off of there, that's going to be your number 1 cylinder. You'll notice up in the front, both of those will be off at an angle. So those are the even numbered cylinders. This is the odd numbered cylinders back here. Okay. We, of course, have our floating cam ring in here. Here's your master rod down there, which attached to it are your articulating rods that are in here. And we got the same thing, floating cam ring up there. You've got your cylinders, big old counterweights. Of course, this one has a supercharger, turning about 11 times for every 1 time of the crankshaft. In fact, we'll fire this thing up, and so maybe you can kind of spot that in the video. There'll be some other things we're going to talk about here too in relation to the cam. You'll notice how that the cam ring in this guy is going to be rotating the opposite direction of the crankshaft rotating. Another thing I want to point out too, while we're at this scraper ring that's on these things, watch in the video here how close this ring comes down here to the bottom of the skirt. So that we're going to talk about where the order that cylinders are removed, because if you get the wrong order, the articulating rod can fall out of where it's supposed to be, dragging that ring down and can pop out down here. And so that's why there's that rule on just about any engine. Whenever you are removing cylinders, you want to have that piston up at top center, compression stroke, so that you're relaxing the valve train up here. You don't want to have the cam, when it's on one of its lobes, putting some unusual pressure on that, making it difficult to loosen hardware and stuff as you take it apart. So you always want to be top center, compression stroke when removing cylinders. Okay, we'll fire this thing up. Notice how it's turning opposite of the rotation of the crankshaft on that cam ring. Now, I suppose if you want to watch that some more, you can play the video. You have the luxury of being able to play the video back and watch that. Okay, we'll go back in here. Get this set up here for a little demonstration. So the double row radial engines, they have kind of a unique thing that's done with them in that they use a couple of, I call them magic numbers. I suppose in the math world, if I was a math instructor, there's probably some form where this applies what's happening here. But when I have a 14-cylinder radial engine, I'm going to use a couple of again, I'll call them the magic numbers. I'm either going to use the number 9 or the number 5 when figuring up firing order. Now, one way to remember this, if I take just these numbers by themselves, 9 and 5, they of course add up to be 14. If I've got an 18-cylinder radial engine, those numbers are going to be 11 and 7. But what I'm going to do with these numbers, I'm either going to add 9 or I'm going to minus 5. Or same thing down here with the 18-cylinder, I'm going to ask or add 11 or subtract 7. So the way that works, of course, I start off with, always starting off with cylinder number 1, and I'm either going to add the 9 or I'm going to minus a 5. So I can't use a minus 5 because there's no negative numbered cylinder. But 1 plus 9, of course, is 10. 10 plus 9 would be 18, but since I've only got 14 cylinders, I'm going to minus 5. So 10 minus 5 is 5. 5 plus 9 is 14. 14 minus 5 is 8. Did I do that right? 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. No. I suddenly got brain dead on my math here. 9 and 5. Oh, I would. 14 minus 5, of course, is 9. 9 minus 5 is 4. 4 plus 9 is 13. 13 minus 5 is 8. 8 minus 5 is 3. 3 plus 9 is 12. 12 minus 5 is 7. 7 minus 5 is 2. I'm running out of room over here. 2 plus 9 is 11. 11 minus, I'll just barely get it in, is 6. And 6 minus 5, of course, back to number 1 again. So that should be all 14 cylinders. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Okay, so we've got some test questions that's going to ask you, for instance, what is the 4th cylinder to fire on an 18-cylinder radial engine? What is the 4th cylinder to fire on an 18-cylinder radial engine? So I do the same thing, start off with number 1. 1 plus 11 is 12. 12 minus 7 is 5. 5 plus 11 is 16. So the 4th cylinder to fire there would be cylinder number 16. Okay, so there, and they'll do the same thing to you like on the single row. What is the 3rd cylinder to fire on that single row? And of course we know we fire all the odd first, 1, 3, 5. And so the 3rd cylinder to fire on that single row would be cylinder number 5. And so that's how they would figure out the firing orders. Back when I was a youngster watching some of the older radial engine mechanics, it kind of impressed you. They didn't tell you what but they could do some of this in their head and kind of magically come up with what the firing order is on the radial engine without having to look in the book. Okay. Next special thing we want to talk about is our cam speed. And cam speed, you notice that cam out there was turning the opposite direction of the crankshaft, but there's a formula for figuring out cam speed. And that formula is 1/2 divided by the number of lobes, and we'll write this out on a single track. Okay, so when I look at a cam from kind of the side view, if I were to count these guys around here, I'd see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But I'm only supposed to utilize the number of lobes that are on a single track. So this one is identified as a 3-lobe cam ring. Okay, so like what we didn't take an opportunity to count them out there, but on that R2800, which is basically like 2 9-cylinder radial engines put together, it was identified as a 4-lobe floating cam ring. So utilizing this formula, you could come up with a decimal answer for what the speed is. What I've done to get a fractional answer to that question is in the engine, so you typically could have like either a 3-lobe, 4-lobe, 5-lobe cam. And so what I've done is a little quick shortcut here, mathematical. If I take that 3 and double it, put a 6, and then put the 1 over it, that a 3-lobe cam in a radial engine turning 1/6 of what the crankshaft's turning. The 4-lobe is going to be turning 1/8 of what the crankshaft. So on that engine out there we were just watching spin, the cam, the crankshaft would turn 8 times for every once that the cam ring spun around, because it's turning 1/8 of crankshaft speed. And of course the 5-lobe, which of course then would be turning 1/10. There is a test question that asks, what is the speed? So the question is, you've got a 4-lobe cam. What is the speed of that cam, and what direction is it turning? So in a 9-cylinder radial engine, you can have either a 4-lobe or you can have a 5-lobe. So a 4-lobe, as you'll notice it's spinning out there, it's turning the opposite direction so that it can get the same amount of work done that a 5-lobe does. So if you had that same engine out there that had a 5-lobe cam, you would have saw it turning the same direction. So in order to get the same amount of work, the two things have to come at each other quicker with that 4-lobe. And so the 4-lobe, of course, turns 1/8, and it's going to be turning. That's the one test question. So if you just wanted to memorize that rather than trying to figure out, there is a chart that you'll see in your book that looks like this. So if you're reading your book, you'll see we're on a 5-cylinder. I can have, and that's another little magic thing that happens there. You know, you notice it's either a 2-lobe or 3-lobe. Those add up to be what can be in a 5-cylinder. If I have a 7-cylinder engine, I could have either a 3-lobe or a 4-lobe. Or the 9-cylinder, like what we were looking at, because we got 2 9-cylinders put together, I could have the 4-lobe or the 5-lobe. And then, of course, I've circled it on this chart here, where it turns 1/8 of what the crankshaft turns, and of course, is going to be turning the opposite direction, because all the smaller lobe cams have to turn the opposite direction. The higher lobe ones would turn the same direction of the crankshaft. But like I say, if you just want to memorize that and kind of skip all that, that works as well too. Okay.